I am holding a brushed chrome Zippo lighter that hasn't sparked a flame in 20 years. It sits on my desk next to my flight logbooks. A heavy little rectangle of metal that smells faintly of old flint and butane. The inscription on the side is worn down to the brass. But if you tilt it into the light, you can still read the letters. To Dutch, thanks for the lift. I don't smoke anymore. Haven't since the 90s. But I keep this lighter because the man who gave it to me should have died in a freezing swamp 40 years ago. According to the official mission report filed by the Department of Defense, that man walked out of the wilderness on his own power, driven by superior training and adrenaline. That report is a lie. It's a piece of paper designed to cover up the fact that when the chips were down, the United States military was ready to leave a 19-year-old kid to freeze to death in the Cascade Mountains. It was October of 1982. The kind of autumn that feels more like the dead of winter in the Pacific Northwest. I was working as a private contractor, flying a refurbished Bell UH-1 Huey for a training exercise that didn't officially exist. The government called it Advanced Seer, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. But it was really just a way to test how much punishment a human body could take before it broke. My job was simple. Ferry the brass around, drop supplies at checkpoints, and stay quiet. I was good at the quiet part. I'd done 2 tours in Vietnam, flying slicks, and I'd learned that the pilot who asks questions is the pilot who doesn't get his contract renewed. I kept my head down, checked my gauges, and cashed the checks. The weather turned on the 3rd day. We were operating out of a temporary airfield near the Alpine Lakes wilderness, a stretch of jagged peaks and dense timber that ate airplanes for breakfast. The forecast called for light rain, but by noon the ceiling had dropped to 500 feet, and the temperature plummeted. Rain turned to sleet, and the wind started howling down the canyons like a freight train. It was the kind of weather that grounds birds and keeps sensible men near a wood stove. But we weren't dealing with sensible men. We were dealing with Major Bill Strickland, a career officer who looked at his soldiers the way a mechanic looks at spare parts useful until they break, then easily replaced. Strickland walked into the Cum's tent, shaking the ice off his poncho. His face set in a hard line. I was drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid, trying to warm my hands on the tin mug. All units are accounted for, except Bravo 3, the radio operator said, his voice cracking. Bravo 3. I'd met him on the tarmac 2 days earlier, a skinny kid from Kentucky with a grin that was too big for his face. He'd asked me if the Huey was hard to fly, looking at the machine with the kind of awe you usually see in little boys. Now, Ray was somewhere out there in the timber, 10 miles off the grid, with nothing but a flight suit and a survival knife, while the temperature dropped below freezing. Ground the fleet, Strickland said, barely looking up from the map table. Visibility is 0. We'll resume the extraction at 0600 hours. I set my coffee down, the metal cup clanking against the folding table. Major, with respect, I said, my voice sounding rustier than I intended. That kid is wet, and the wind chill is dropping. If he's injured, he won't make it to 0600. Strickland turned to me, his eyes cold and flat. He knew the risks when he signed up. Langford, I'm not risking $1 million aircraft and a flight crew for one trainee who couldn't read a compass. Sit down. I sat down. That was the rule. You listened to the client, but as the hours ticked by, The sound of the sleet hitting the canvas roof of the tent started to sound like gravel. I closed my eyes, and I was back in the Ashao Valley, 1968, watching 3 of my crew chief's friends disappear into the elephant grass because a colonel on the radio told me the LZ was too hot. I lived with that memory every time I tried to sleep. I lived with the faces of the men I left behind because I was following orders. I looked at Strickland, who was busy typing up an incident report, probably already figuring out how to phrase Ray Otter's death as a training accident. I stood up and walked out of the tent. The cold hit me like a physical blow. Wet and biting, I walked past the mess hall, past the latrines, and straight to the flight line. My Yui was tied down, the rotor blades sagging under the weight of the ice. I didn't have a flight plan. I didn't have clearance. I had a heavy knot in my stomach that told me I wasn't going to add another ghost to my collection tonight. I climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of JP for fuel and sweat greeting me. I flipped the battery switch, and the instrument panel glowed to life, a comforting green in the gray evening. Starting a turbine engine is a process you feel more than you hear. The whine starts high and thin, building until the igniters catch. The rumble vibrates through the seat and into your spine. I watched the temperature gauge, praying the engine wouldn't hang start in the cold. Itkout. Itkout. The rotors began to turn, sluggish at first, shedding sheets of ice that shattered against the tarmac. I saw the tent flap open. I saw Strickland running out, waving his arms, his mouth moving in a scream I couldn't hear over the turbine. I didn't look at him. I pulled collective, and the skids left the earth. I banked hard to the west, staying low to keep under the radar ceiling. The weather was worse than I thought. The sleet was hammering the windshield so hard I felt like I was flying inside a drum. I relied on my instrument, trusting the artificial horizon more than my own eyes. I knew roughly where Ray was supposed to be Sector 4. A valley full of marshland and old-growth cedar. If he was smart, he'd have dug in. If he was hurt, he'd be exposed. I flipped on the thermal imaging camera, mounted under the nose. It was primitive tech compared to what they have now. A grainy black and white monitor that turned heat into glowing white blobs. I flew nap over the earth, 50 feet above the treetops. My hands working the cyclic and collective in a constant, twitchy dance to keep the wind from slamming me into a ridge. It was stupid. It was suicide. But I kept seeing that kid's grin. I kept hearing the silence of the radio. I pushed the bird harder, the airframe groaning under the stress. I scanned the monitor, looking for the small, distinct heat signature of a human being. I saw deer huddled in thickets. I saw a coyote moving along a ridge, and then, near the edge of the swamp in Sector 4, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The heat signature on the monitor was massive. It washed out the screen, a brilliant white flare against the gray background of the cold swamp. My first thought was a bear. Grizzlies were rare in this part of the Cascades, but not impossible. And a big boar could put out a lot of heat, but the shape was wrong. It was too tall, too broad at the shoulders. It wasn't moving on all fours. It was upright, wading through the freezing muck, with a power that pushed a wake of water ahead of it. I squinted at the screen, wiping sweat from my eyes despite the freezing draft leaking through the door seal. Then I saw the second heat signature. It was smaller, cooler, trailing behind the massive shape. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a body. The large creature was dragging something through the swamp. Jesus, I whispered, the word lost in the roar of the rotors. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Ray had been injured, maybe unconscious, and a predator had found him. I was watching a feeding event in real time. The creature stopped, adjusted its grip, and continued moving. It wasn't erratic. It was purposeful. I reached down and unholstered my .38 revolver, placing it on the glare shield. A useless gesture. I couldn't shoot from a flying helicopter. Not with a handgun. And definitely not while trying to pilot in a storm, but the instinct was there. I had to do something. I thumbed the radio switch, intending to call it in. Then remembered I was rogue. Strickland wouldn't send help, even if I told him I saw a monster eating a private. He'd probably tell me to return to base and stop hallucinating. I was on my own. I pushed the nose down. Dropping altitude. The radar altimeter screamed a warning. Low, 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 but I ignored it. I needed to scare that thing off. The Huey is a loud beast. A thumping, screaming machine that terrifies anything natural if I could get low enough. The noise in the rotor wash might panic the animal and make it drop the kid. Primera coming. Fast skimming the tops of the cedars. The skids clipping the upper branches. The helicopter bucked in the turbulence, fighting me every inch of the way. On the monitor, the image grew clearer. The creature was bipedal. Definitely bipedal. It walked with a stride that ate up the ground, moving through waist-deep water that would have bogged down a man in seconds. The body it was dragging wasn't thrashing. It was limp. That was the detail that twisted the knife in my gut. Ray wasn't fighting back. He was either dead or so deep in shock that he didn't feel the water. I lined up the aircraft, intending to hover right over them, to blast them with 100 mile-an-hour wind. As I closed the distance, the creature didn't bolt. A bear would have scrambled. A cougar would have vanished. This thing kept moving, ignoring the approaching thunder of the helicopter. It was focused. It was heading toward higher ground, toward a rocky ridge that broke through the tree line about half a mile east. Why take the prey to high ground? Predators usually drag a kill into dense cover to eat it. This behavior didn't track with anything I knew about wildlife biology. I was 200 yards out now. I flipped on the external spotlight. The night's in. The beam cut through the sleet like a lightsaber, illuminating the swamp in harsh, blinding detail. The light hit the water, reflecting off the ripples. I saw the reeds flattened by the creature's passage. I saw the steam rising off its body, a cloud of heat meeting the freezing air, and then the beam hit the creature itself. It was covered in dark, matted fur, slick with rain and mud. The muscles beneath the coat bunched and released with mechanical efficiency. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with a back as wide as a refrigerator. But it was the way it moved that stopped my breath. It wasn't dragging the body by the leg, bouncing the head off rocks and roots. It had the soldier tucked under one arm, clamped against its side like a football. High up on the torso, the soldier's head was propped on the creature's massive deltoid muscle. It was a cradle carry. I blinked. Sure I was seeing things. I adjusted the spotlight, tightening the beam. The creature turned its head away from the light, shielding its eyes with a free hand. But it didn't drop the boy. It pulled him tighter. It was shielding him from the rotor wash. It was trying to keep the freezing spray off the kid's face. I pulled back on the cyclic, bringing the helicopter into a hover 50 feet above them. The water below churned into a frenzy. The creature stopped then. It couldn't move forward against the force of the wind that was generating. It planted its feet, widening its stance to keep from being blown over. It looked up, not at the light, but past it, into the cockpit. I felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with the thermo camera. It was looking at me. I stared down through the chin bubble, the glass vibrating against my boots. The creature's face was a mask of dark skin and wet hair, but the eyes were visible in the spill of the spotlight. They were deep set, reflecting the amber glow of the cockpit lights. There was no panic in them. There was no predatory rage. There was annoyance. It looked like a construction foreman watching an idiot drive a forklift through a wet cement pour. It was the look of someone whose difficult job just got harder because of an amateur. The realization hit me hard enough to make my hands shake on the controls. It wasn't killing him. It was saving him. The creature was hauling ray otters out of the swamp, keeping his head above water, shielding him from the elements, and moving him toward the only dry land in the sector. And I, the supposed savior in the $1 million machine, was the one drowning them with my rotor wash. I was the threat. My God, I whispered. I eased forward on the cyclic, moving the helicopter slightly to the side to direct the blast of air away from them. The creature adjusted immediately. It sensed the drop in wind pressure and surged forward again. It didn't look back at me. It knew I had moved. It understood the physics of the encounter instantly. It trusted that I had figured it out. That level of tactical awareness was terrifying. It implied an intelligence that wasn't just reacting, but analyzing. I watched as they approached a section of the swamp where the water deepened into a channel. The current was fast here, swollen by the storm runoff. The creature didn't hesitate. It stepped into the channel. The water rose to its chest. I saw Ray's body start to float, the buoyancy of his flight suit fighting the creature's grip. The creature shifted its hold, moving Ray higher, practically holding him out of the water like a precious offering. The footing was treacherous. I saw the creature stumble, its massive legs slipping on a submerged log. For a second, I thought they were both going under. The current caught them, twisting the creature's torso. If it let go of the boy, it could regain its balance easily. It could save itself. That's what a wild animal does. Self-preservation is the only law. I held my breath, my thumb hovering over the collective, ready to try a desperate and likely fatal winch rescue. But the creature didn't let go. Instead, it slammed its free hand into the muddy bank, fingers digging deep into the soil to anchor them. It took the full force of the freezing current against its back, turning its body into a breakwater to create a calm eddy for the boy. It held that position for 10 seconds, shuddering with effort, until it found solid footing again. It pulled itself up the bank, water cascading off its fur, dragging Ray back onto solid, if muddy, ground. I saw the creature pause then. It leaned over the boy. I zoomed the camera in. It was checking him. I saw a massive, dark hand gently touch the side of Ray's face. It wasn't a sniff or a prod. It was a check for temperature, for life. The creature lingered there for a moment, and even from 50 feet up, I could feel the exhaustion in its posture. It was tired. It was burning calories it couldn't afford to lose in this weather. Why? The question bounced around my skull. Why would something like this risk exposure and injury for a human? We were the invaders here. We were the ones flying noisy machines over its home, setting up firing ranges, cutting down timber. Buell writes it should have left Ray to rot, or snapped his neck to silence the noise. But it was treating him with a tenderness that I hadn't seen from his own commanding officer. The creature stood up, shaking the water from its coat like a massive dog. It looked up at me again. This time, it raised an arm and pointed. It pointed toward the ridgeline, toward a flat shelf of rock that was clear of trees. It was the only spot big enough to land a helicopter within 5 miles. It was giving me coordinates. It was telling me where to go. I felt a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow. I wasn't the pilot anymore. I was just the taxi. This creature was the rescue swimmer, the medic, the ground team. I keyed the mic, knowing no one could hear me, but needing to say it anyway. "Roger that," I said, my voice thick. "I have the visual moving to extraction point." I pulled the nose up and banked toward the ridge, leaving the spotlight on them as a beacon. a promise that I wasn't going to leave them in the dark. The terrain shifted from swamp to scree. As they started climbing the lower spine of the ridge, it was a steep incline, maybe 40 degrees of loose shale and wet moss that would have been a nightmare for a mountain goat, let alone something carrying 200 pounds of dead weight. I hovered the Huey just off to the left, keeping my distance to minimize the rotor wash, but close enough to keep the light on their path. The wind was picking up at this altitude, buffeting the tail boom and making the pedals kick against my feet. I had to fight the bird constantly, just to hold position, my forearms burning with the tension. But I couldn't look away from the struggle unfolding on that slope. The creature was moving slower now. The explosive power I'd seen in the swamp was replaced by a grinding, mechanical determination. Every step was a calculation. I watched it kick a foothold into the sliding rock, test the weight, and then heave its massive frame upward, dragging Ray along with it. The soldier's boots scraped against the stone, bouncing limply. It was an ugly, brutal ascent. There was no grace in it, just the raw physics of muscle working against gravity. I could see the creature's breath coming in heavy, rhythmic plumes of steam that whipped away instantly in the gale. Halfway up, they hit a patch of slick mud, where a small landslide had cleared the vegetation. The creature stepped, and the ground gave way. It dropped to one knee, sliding backward 5 yards before it managed to dig its free hand into a tangle of roots. Ray swung out wildly, his head dangerously close to a jagged outcrop of granite. The creature didn't scramble or panic. It simply locked its arm, taking the strain of both their weights on a single shoulder joint. I winced, waiting for the pop of a dislocation. But the limb held. It pulled them back up, inch by agonizing inch, until they were past the slide. I checked my fuel gauges. I was burning juice fast in this hover, and the headwind was eating into my reserves. I had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time before I'd have to turn back or risk flaming out. "Come on," I muttered, gripping the collective. "Move your ass." It felt strange to be rooting for it. This thing that shouldn't exist. But out here in the storm, the lines were drawn differently. It wasn't human versus animal. It was life versus the mountain. And right now, the mountain was winning. The creature stopped at a small switchback. Leaning heavily against a fir tree, it adjusted Ray's position, shifting the boy from one shoulder to the other. I zoomed the camera in. The creature's chest was heaving like a bellows. It was gassed. It looked up at the helicopter, squinting against the glare of the spotlight. For a second, I thought it was going to quit. I thought it was going to leave the kid there safely out of the water. Sure. But still miles from help and save itself. That's what a bear would do. That's what a survivalist would do. But it didn't. It took a deep breath, shook the ice from its coat, and pushed off the tree. It started climbing again. The slope got rockier near the top, forcing the creature to use one hand to scramble while keeping the other locked around Ray. I watched it navigate a narrow chimney of rock, placing its feet with a precision that didn't match its bulk. It was careful with the boy. Every time the terrain got rough, it shielded Ray's body with its own, taking the scrapes and the hits against the stone. The sleet turned to snow as we gained altitude. The visibility dropped to near zero, a wall of white rushing past the windshield. I was flying on instruments now, trusting the radar altimeter to keep me from smashing into the cliff face. I lost visual on them for a few seconds, my heart jumping into my throat. I swung the nose around, searching, panic flaring in my chest. If I lost them now, Ray was dead. The snow would bury them in an hour. Then I saw the heat signature again, a faint white glow pushing through the blizzard. They were close to the crest. The creature was practically crawling now, using its knuckles to drag itself over the final lip of the ridge. It wasn't walking upright anymore. It was dragging itself and the boy by sheer will. I pushed the Huey up over the edge of the plateau, the sudden updraft kicking the nose high. I fought the controls, leveling out over the flat expanse of rock that marked the summit. They crested the ridge a moment later. The creature pulled Ray up onto the flat ground and collapsed. It just dropped to its knees, head hanging low, arms dangling. It sat there for a long count, motionless in the snow. I hovered 50 yards away, giving them space, waiting to see if it would get up. I realized then that I was holding my breath. I was witnessing a marathon finish, a physical exertion that would have killed a horse. And the runner was something I didn't even have a name for. The creature didn't stay down for long. It pushed itself up to a standing position, swaying slightly in the wind. That's when I saw the blood. It wasn't just a scrape. The thermal camera showed a hot, dark streak running down the outside of its right thigh, a sharp contrast to the cooling temperature of its fur. It must have happened in the river or on the slate. During the climb, the wound was deep, jagged, likely from a sharp rock or a hidden branch underwater. I brought the helicopter in a little closer, fascinated and horrified. In the wild, an injury like that is a death sentence. Infection sets in, speed drops, and you can't hunt. This creature had to know that. It was an apex predator. It understood the cost of a limb better than I did, yet it had walked 2 miles on a sliced leg, carrying an extra 200 pounds, uphill, in a freezing storm. It had prioritized the safety of a stranger over its own biological integrity. The creature looked down at its leg. It touched the wound briefly, its fingers coming away dark and wet. It didn't lick it or try to pack it with snow. It ignored Italiano. Its attention snapped back to Ray. The boy was shivering violently now, the hypothermia settling in deep. The creature knelt beside him, blocking the wind with its body. It wasn't checking the wound on itself. It was checking the boy's vitals again. I felt a wave of shame wash over me. I was sitting in a heated cockpit, wearing a survival vest and a flight helmet, protected by layers of technology. Down there, in the biting cold, a monster was bleeding out to save one of ours. I thought about Strickland back in the tent, drinking coffee, talking about risk assessment. Strickland wouldn't have walked 10 yards with a cut leg to save Ray. He would have called it a tactical loss. The creature's behavior was so human it hurt to watch. It adjusted the collar of Ray's flight suit, trying to pull it tighter around his neck. It brushed the wet hair off his forehead. These were small, fussy movements, the kind a mother makes when she's tucking a kid in. It wasn't instinct. Instinct is binary. Eat or sleep, fight or flight. This was empathy. This was a decision to nurture. I noticed something else as the creature moved in the light. Its fur was graying around the muzzle and shoulders. It wasn't young. This was an old male, a veteran of these woods. It moved with the stiffness of age, or maybe arthritis, which made the physical feat I'd just witnessed even more impossible. It had spent its reserves. It had emptied the tank, and it had done it for a hairless ape that probably smelled like jet fuel and gunpowder. The blood was dripping onto the snow now, creating small, dark craters. The creature shifted its weight, favoring the good leg, but it never moved away from Ray. It stayed positioned between the boy and the wind, a living windbreak. It looked up at me, blinking against the spotlight. There was no aggression in the stance, only a weary patience. "I'm done," the pasta said. "I got him here. The rest is on you." I checked the area. The plateau was flat, solid granite, good for a skid landing. I could set the bird down about 30 yards from them, but I hesitated. I didn't want to spook it if I came down now. The noise would be deafening. Would it attack? Would it run? Or was it too tired to care? I kept my hand on the stick, watching the creature, waiting for a sign. It seemed to sense my hesitation. It stood up slowly, wincing as it put weight on the bad leg. It took a few steps backward, away from Ray. It was giving me the LZ. It was clearing the zone. It understood that for the metal bird to land, it needed space. It limped toward the tree line, leaving the boy alone on the rock. A small, dark shape in the middle of the white expanse. I lowered the collective, and the Huey started to descend. The ground rushed up to meet me, gray rock, white snow, and the small, still form of Ray Otters. I had to focus on the landing. The wind over the ridge was unpredictable, swirling in eddies that could flip a helicopter if you weren't careful. I crabbed into the wind, feeling the skids search for purchase on the uneven stone. The metal groaned as I set it down, the weight of the aircraft settling onto the mountain. I didn't kill the engine. I couldn't. If I shut it down up here in this cold, I might never get it started again. I rolled the throttle to idle, the rotor blades slowing to a lazy thump-thump-thump that echoed off the peaks. I unbuckled my harness, grabbed the medical kit from the back, and shoved the door open. The cold hit me instantly, a physical slap that took my breath away. It was Isley, 10 degrees below freezing. I jumped from the skids, my boots slipping on the icy rock. I ran toward Ray, keeping my head low under the rotors. Was blue. His lips were cracked, and his skin had that waxy, translucent look of severe hypothermia. But he was breathing, shallow, ragged gasps, but breathing. I got you, kid. I yelled over the engine noise, though I knew he couldn't hear me. I got you. I grabbed the collar of his flight suit and started to drag him toward the chopper. He was heavy, dead weight, and I slipped twice, cursing the ice. I was struggling to move him 10 yards on flat ground. The creature had carried him miles. The comparison made me feel weak, inadequate. I got him to the cargo door and hefted him inside, strapping him onto the floorboards. I threw a wool blanket over him, tucked it in tight. I paused before climbing back into the pilot's seat. I turned and looked toward the tree line. The spotlight was still on, cutting a cone of illumination into the darkness. At the very edge of the light, just before the trees swallowed the world, it was standing there. The creature, it hadn't left. It was watching to make sure I actually took him. It looked massive against the backdrop of the pines, a shadow that breathed. The snow was piling up on its shoulders, turning it into a ghost. It wasn't hiding. It was standing tall, one hand resting on a tree trunk for support, the other hanging by its side. We locked eyes across the 50 yards of desolate rock. This wasn't a monster sighting. This was a handover, a transfer of custody. It had done its part of the mission, and now it was waiting to see if I would do mine. I felt a strange compulsion to say something, to yell thank you into the storm. But the words felt small, stupid. You don't thank a force of nature, you just respect it. The creature didn't roar. It didn't beat its chest. It just watched me with those dark, intelligent eyes. It saw me load the boy. It saw that he was safe. And in that moment, the tension that had been holding its body up seemed to drain away. It slumped slightly, the exhaustion finally taking over. It had finished the job. I climbed into the cockpit and pulled the door shut, cutting off the wind. The silence of the headset was jarring. I looked out the side window. The creature was still there, a sentinel in the snow. I realized then that I was the intruder here. I was the alien. This was its mountain, its storm, its rules. And for reasons I would never understand, it had chosen to show mercy to a trespasser. I reached for the throttle, ready to wake the machine up. But I couldn't take my eyes off the figure in the trees. I sat in the cockpit, hand wrapped around the cyclic. But I didn't pull pitch. Not yet. The spotlight was still fixed on the creature standing at the timberline. The snow was coming down harder now. Big wet flakes that stuck to the windshield and melted into rivers of distortion. But I could still see its face clearly. The distance between us was about 50 yards. But it felt like we were sitting across a table from each other. There was no fear left in me. The adrenaline that had been keeping me sharp was starting to fade. Replaced by a strange, heavy quiet, I raised my right hand. It was a reflex. The same wave I'd given to ground crews 1,000 times before lifting off. A signal. I see you. We're good. It wasn't a salute. I wasn't saluting a superior officer. I was acknowledging an equal. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there, snow accumulating on its shoulders like a mantle. I thought maybe it didn't understand the gesture. Maybe to a wild animal, a raised hand just looks like a threat. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature dipped its chin. It was a single, measured nod. It exhaled, and I saw the steam cloud billow out from its nostrils, backlit by the spotlight. It was the most human thing I had ever seen. It wasn't mimicry. It was communication. It was saying, go. Take him. The connection in that moment was stronger than anything I'd felt with the men back at the base. We had both worked to save the same life. We were on the same team. The creature turned then. Not abruptly, but with a slow, heavy grace. It stepped back into the shadows of the cedars. 1 second, it was there. A solid, breathing reality. And the next, it was just part of the forest. The darkness swallowed it whole. I stared at the empty space where it had been, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of loss. I wanted to call it back. I wanted to throw it a survival ration. A blanket, something. But what do you give a king in his own kingdom? I turned my attention back to the gauges. Oil pressure. Good turbine. Temp. Stable. I rolled the throttle open, and the engine scream climbed back to a deafening whine. I pulled collective, and the Huey leaped off the rock, eager to be back in the air. I swung the nose around, away from the ridge, away from the creature, and pointed the bird toward the lights of the airfield in the valley below. As I descended, I couldn't stop thinking about the blood on the snow. The creature was hurt. It was cold, and it had just walked away into a blizzard to die or heal alone. I looked back at Ray, unconscious in the back. No idea. He was going to wake up in a hospital bed, thinking he was lucky. He would never know that his luck had been 8 feet tall and covered in fur. The flight back was a blur of instruments and radio chatter. The base came into view, a cluster of yellow lights and the gray soup. I keyed the mic. Base ops. This is roughly Ghost Rider. Inbound with 1 pox. Urgent medical. Get the meat wagon ready. The voice on the other end was confused, demanding my clearance code, demanding to know where I'd been. I ignored them. I just lined up on the pad and set it down. The moment the skids touched the tarmac, the world exploded into chaos. Medics swarmed the aircraft before the rotors had even stopped turning. They dragged Ray out, shouting vitals, cutting off his wet clothes. I sat in the cockpit, flipping switches, shutting down the bird. My hands were shaking again. The cold from the open door was seeping into my bones. Or maybe it was just the shock finally catching up to me. I saw Major Strickland marching across the flight line. He looked like a thunderhead wrapped in a poncho. He didn't look at Ray. He didn't check on the soldier he'd been willing to ride off. He walked straight to my door and yanked it open. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Langford?" He screamed, his face inches from mine. "You stole a classified aircraft. You violated a direct stand-down order. I'll have your license. I'll have you in Leavenworth. I unbuckled my harness and stepped out, my boots hitting the wet pavement. I was too tired to be afraid of him. I brought your boy back, I said, my voice flat. He's alive. You're welcome. Strickland grabbed my flight suit. I don't care if you brought back the Pope. You're done. Then he stopped. He was looking past me, at the belly of the helicopter, at the camera mount. What's on the tape? He asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The thermal camera recorded to a reel-to-reel deck in the back. I hadn't thought about it. I had just been flying. But Strickland knew. He knew that if I'd been flying unauthorized search and rescue, I'd been recording. Nothing, I said. Just snow and trees. He pushed past me and climbed into the back. I watched him rip the tape reel out of the deck. He held it up to the light, inspecting it like it was a weapon. This is government property, he said. Classified data from a restricted training zone. He shoved the reel into his pocket. You saw a bear. Langford. A big bear. If you say otherwise, if you talk to the press, if you even whisper about this in a bar, I will bury you. Do you understand? I looked at him. I looked at the medics, loading Ray into the ambulance. I thought about the creature on the ridge, bleeding for a stranger. And I looked at this man, this officer, worried about liability and paperwork. Yeah, I said, spitting on the tarmac. I saw a bear. A really big bear. Strickland sneered and walked away. I never saw the tape again. I was fired the next morning. My contract terminated for safety violations. I drove out of the main gate without looking back. 22 years later, I walked into a dive bar in Lexington, Kentucky. It was 2004. The place smelled of stale beer and lemon floor cleaner. I scanned the room and saw him in a booth near the back. Ray Otters. He looked older, obviously gray hair. A little heavier, but I recognized the eyes. He was sitting in a wheelchair. I'd heard he lost the use of his legs in a car accident in the 90s. Life hadn't been kind to him. I walked over and stood by the table. Ray? He looked up, squinting through the smoke. Yeah. Do I know you? I gave you a lift once, I said. Up in the Cascades, October 82. His face went pale. He put his beer down, his hand trembling slightly. Dutch, he whispered. The pilot. I sat down. We didn't talk for a long time. We just drank, letting the noise of the bar fill the silence. Finally, Ray cleared his throat. They told me I walked out, he said, staring at his glass. The official reports that I self-rescued, navigated to the extraction point while suffering from hypothermia. He laughed. A bitter, sharp sound. I always knew it was bullshit. I couldn't walk. I broke my ankle in the river before the hypothermia even set in. He looked around the bar to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in close. I remember the smell, he said softly, like wet dog and pine needles and musk. Strong musk. He pulled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt. On his upper arm, faded but visible, was a pattern of faint white scars. 4 distinct oval marks. Fingerprints. I wasn't walking, Dutch. I was being carried. My chest tightened. I know. Ray. I saw him. Ray's eyes widened. You saw him? You saw it? Yeah. I watched him carry you 3 miles uphill. He took a hit for you, Ray. Cut his leg bad on the rocks. But he didn't stop. Ray closed his eyes, tears leaking out the corners. I wasn't unconscious the whole time, he whispered. I was fading in and out. I remember the cold, and I remember humming. He looked at me, desperate for me to believe him. It was humming to me. Dutch. Like a lullaby. Deep in its chest. It was trying to keep me calm. It knew I was scared. The monster hummed, I said, smiling for the first time in years. Yeah. He hummed. Ray wiped his face. Why? Why did he do it? I don't know, I said. Maybe he just didn't want you to die on his watch. Maybe he's a better soldier than any of us. We sat there for hours, piecing the night together. Ray told me about the fear, the moment he fell into the water, the feeling of being grabbed by something massive. He told me about the warmth of the fur. I told him about the climb, the blood, the nod. It felt like we were closing a wound that had been open for 2 decades. I still have nightmares, Ray said, but not about him. I dream about the cold, and then I dream about the arms holding me up, and I wake up feeling safe. He looked down at his useless legs. Strickland left me. Didn't he? He grounded the fleet. Yeah, I said. He did. He wrote you off. And that thing, Ray pointed a thumb over his shoulder. That wild animal didn't. The contrast hung in the air between us. Major Strickland. The civilized man. The leader. The human. Was the monster, and the Sasquatch. The beast. The nightmare of the woods. Was the savior. It turned everything I knew about humanity upside down. People talk about them like they're demons, Ray said. Like they're bloodthirsty killers, but I'm alive because one of them had a heart. He took a sip of his beer. I wish I could thank him. I think he knows, I said. He waited. Ray. He waited until I had you safe in the bird before he left. He saw you were okay. Ray nodded slowly. That's good. That's good to know. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a Zippo lighter. He slid it across the table to me. I don't smoke anymore, but I want you to have this. For coming back. For disobeying the order. I picked up the lighter. It was warm from his hand. Thanks, Ray. No, he said. Thank him. I'm just the package. You two. You were the delivery team. I walked out of that bar and into the Kentucky night. The air was warm. Nothing like the Cascades, but I shivered anyway. I looked up at the stars. I thought about the creature. Was he still out there? Was he still patrolling that ridge? Watching the timberline? Or had the wound taken him that winter? I like to think he's still there. I like to think he's old now. Gray all over. Maybe teaching a younger one how to move through the swamp without making a sound. I like to think that somewhere in those mountains, there is a code that hasn't been broken yet. A code that says life is precious. That you don't leave the fallen behind. That you help when you can, even if the one you're helping is a different species. I kept the lighter. It's sitting right here. Sometimes I flick the lid open just to hear the click. It reminds me of the mechanical sounds of the helicopter, but mostly it reminds me of the silence of that ridge. The silence of a creature that could have crushed us both, but chose to carry us. Instead, we draw lines on maps. We build fences. We tell ourselves that we are the masters of this world. The only ones with souls. But I saw a soul that night that burned brighter than any man I've ever served with. I saw a brother in a beast. So, if you're ever out in the high timber, and you feel like you're being watched, don't panic. Just be respectful. Walk soft. And remember that the thing in the trees might not be hunting you. It might just be making sure you make it home. If you believe that loyalty isn't just a human trait, if you think there are things out there that understand honor better than we do, then stick around. Subscribe to the channel. because there are more stories in these flight logs, and I think it's time I told them all. Stay safe out there, and never leave a man behind.